All right, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Phil Fox, Drops of Hope Ministries, and Mr. Mark Charles talking about the Doctrine of Discovery. Coming at you. All right, brothers and sisters, we are live with Mr. Mark Charles of his ministry, Wireless Hogan. Hogan,
yes.
Yes. And my brother Mark Charles here is the author of a book. Most of you who follow this channel understand and know, and I've been promoting this book for a while now. And actually, I have to give a shout out to BK Apologist and MJ Jackson. MJ Jackson was the one, Mr. Charles, who turned me on to your book.
Okay.
And BK Apologist gifted me my first e-copy of this book. And so them two brothers got this information into my hands. And so I have to give them a special shout out. So yeah, so we there's been a lot of us. I'm involved in what's called, or what we have was kind of a subcategory of ministry apologetics called the Urban Apologetics Community, and we deal with minority issues primarily that we would see within Native communities and inner city communities, and deal with a lot of different aspects of kind of unique ministry, kind of a niche type thing. And so your name has come up quite a bit in a lot of our conversations, and so yeah, so you've been actually, your work has been instrumental in a lot of our thought and thinking. So it's with a great honor that you come on today, Mr. Charles. And I appreciate you coming on. So why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and where you come from and why you're here?
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you, Phil. So let me introduce myself. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinashia, Sinbake Dina Nishle, the Tohiglini Bashichin, Sinbake Dina Dashache to Chini Dashanella. Within our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and normally in Navajo you would say Bilagana, but because I wanted to be more traditional and more precise, I decided to find out how to address my mother of Dutch heritage more directly. And so I spoke with some relatives, and we decided on Sinbake Dene, and loosely translated that means I'm from the wooden shoe people, because of the klompen that the Dutch wear. So on my mother's side, I'm Sinbake Dene. My father's mother, my second clan, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sinbake Dene. Then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge to you that I am a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation, and I moved to where I live now with my family, which is Washington, D.C., from the Navajo Nation about 5.5 years ago. And so the lands where I live now, what's now called D.C., is the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor and thank the Piscataway for being the people indigenous, the host people of these lands. And I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. So it's an honor for me to be speaking to you from Piscataway lands, and I want to acknowledge and honor them as the host people of the land where I'm now living.
Dosha Mananach Bago, Mawagiwaga, Maragua, Midishi Maihagadesh Hetz, Mabi Sagi. My name is Defeats the Enemy. That is my native name. And I said, welcome and hello to you, all my relatives. And I'm praying for you. and today is definitely a good day. And I too, your work and how you introduce yourself always has inspired me really to understand and know, because I'm not in my original homelands. I grew up in western North Dakota, in the land of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people, and I know the history behind that. But I've never really thought about taking a look at where I live currently. I'm now in Michigan, and
Yeah.
so the Potawatomi were the tribe that were removed from this current location, and I live in the northern Detroit area. So yeah, it's challenged me a lot, and it's made me really conscious of not only where I live, but to really dig into to look at the history behind some of these things, and some of the things that you preach and that you teach about. And one of those things primarily is this idea of the doctrine of discovery, which some folks I'm sure have heard of, might have heard of. Um, but can you tell us a little bit about this idea of doctrine of discovery and why it's so important?
Yeah, and just I put a link in the private chat for you and me, but if you want to share
Yep.
that out
Yep. I'm going to
publicly,
share that right
it's a
now.
website I use frequently. It's native-land.ca, and it's a great resource to begin your research on whose lands you might be living on. It's not the final authority, but it's one of the best resources I found to begin my research. Wherever I travel around Turtle Island, I always try to find out where I'm going to be or who I'm talking to, and then I can enter in a city or a zip code or a state, and it will tell me the languages spoken, the treaties signed, as well as the people indigenous to those lands. There's been a few times it's been wrong, but it's always given me great places to start my research.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to share that out with your listeners, you're welcome to do that. It's native-land.ca.
Yeah, we
And
did share that link. So
yeah,
there it is.
so regarding the doctrine of discovery, one of the things I want to start off by acknowledging is I am not the first author, nor will I be the last who's been trying to lay out this history. There have been many incredible authors, native authors and non-native authors, who have been writing about the doctrine of discovery. Two people especially come to mind. One is Stephen Newcomb, who is a native man, and he has written a book called Pagans in the Promised Land. And I highly recommend his book. It's a really good resource. It's very meaty. There's a lot of things to digest in that book, but I highly recommend his book. He's been working on issues with the doctrine of discovery for a long time. The other person I want to acknowledge is a woman I had the honor of meeting about a year and a half ago. Her name is Marcella LeBeau, and she actually lives, I think, in North Dakota. And she is a 100-year-old World War II Army veteran. She served as a nurse in World War II, and I met her for the first time when I was at the Frank Lemire Native American Presidential Forum in August of 2019. And she was there. She was 99 years old at the time. She's now over 100. She's still alive. And she was in the front row, and she was assigned to ask questions of the presidential candidates about the Remove the Stain Act, which is to rescind the medals of honor given for the massacre at Wounded Knee. And so she was asking questions of Bernie Sanders, of Kamala Harris, of Elizabeth Warren, of myself. And she asked a few of the candidates, not all of them, but a few of the candidates, she asked them about the doctrine of discovery. And unfortunately, they did not answer her. They did not respond to her question about the doctrine of discovery. I had a chance to do that, but I was so impressed by her tenacity. And the questioning that she gave. And again, she's a 99-year-old, now 100-year-old Army veteran. And I want to definitely honor Marcella LeBeau. She's become a dear friend of mine. And I love the work that she's doing and that others are doing to bring these issues of the doctrine of discovery to the forefront. The Doctrine of Discovery, and my book, which we're talking about today, which is Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery, it's really a series of papal bulls, or edicts of the Catholic Church. They were written between 1452 and 1493. It's essentially, they say things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. convert those people to your exploitation and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. So this is literally the doctrine that ordained European nations to go into continents like Africa and enslave the people because they didn't believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that allowed Columbus, who was lost at sea, to land in this new world, which was already inhabited, Turtle Island, and claimed to have discovered it. The first sentence of my book is, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands. You cannot discover them unless you do not believe the people who were there before you are human. And so this doctrine of discovery, it's a dehumanizing doctrine that not only allowed European nations to enslave African people and discover native peoples, but it literally gets embedded into the foundations of our country. Our Declaration of Independence, 30 lines below the statement all men are created equal, refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. The only reason that those two reconcile is, yes, our founding fathers had this all-inclusive term, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, but they then call natives savages. So what that demonstrates is that their definition of human was actually very narrow. It did not include the native savages whose land they were not only colonizing, they were ethnically cleansing. The Constitution, which starts with another inclusive term, we the people, just a few lines later, Article 1, Section 2, the section that determines who is and who is not covered by the Constitution, who is and who is not protected by this document, it never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. In 1787, when the document was written and signed, that literally left white men. And technically, it was white landowning men who could vote. So then we have years, hundreds of years of Supreme Court case precedent that, going as far back as 1823, sets up the doctrine of discovery as the legal precedent for land titles. I actually gave a TEDx talk. This was maybe about a year and a half ago. Almost 2 years ago now, over 2 years ago, actually it was. I gave a TEDx talk. It's called We the People, the 3 Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History. And I go through that 2005 case pretty in depth. And I demonstrate how that is one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. In the first footnote of the case, it references the doctrine of discovery. It concludes that, using the same argument as they used in 1823, that simply because natives are savages, we cannot rekindle embers of sovereignty over our traditional lands. And that opinion was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the most progressive liberal judges on the Supreme Court.
Right.
How could, people would ask me, how could Ruth have written this opinion? Well, when your land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives are savages, and so therefore they do not have rights to their lands, what that does is it makes white supremacy a bipartisan value, with which Ruth demonstrated back in 2005 when she wrote that opinion. So these are the challenges we face with this doctrine. It's a dehumanizing doctrine. It's been embedded deep into our foundations. And it's a bipartisan value. It's not only held a value by both the left and the right politically, it's a value embraced and held by the church. Whether you're conservative, white evangelical, or whether you're a progressive Christian who's even a person of color, most likely some of your theology is rooted in this doctrine of discovery.
Right. Yeah. So, there was some stuff that sort of happened or sort of set up this ideology. Can you go with some of the earlier history of like setting up Christendom? Because that's where the doctrine of discovery sort of graduated from these thoughts.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the first 4 chapters of our book, and technically chapters 3 and 4 go the most in depth into this, Chapters 1 and 2 really set it up and set the scene, but chapters 3 and 4 go into depth on how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like love your neighbor and pray for those who persecute you, how it got from that to this doctrine of discovery that basically said kill people who don't speak like, act like, behave like, worship like you do. And when I went back to when I was doing the research to kind of figure out where this diverge happened, where this schism took place, I knew about Constantine and his vision at Melvain Bridge, where he said that Jesus appeared to him and told him to conquer in the name of the cross. And he was, and then he converted to Christianity and went on to basically ordain Rome as a Christian empire. So he began this notion of Christian empire, Christendom. And for most of my life, I've blamed the heresy of Christendom on Constantine. But as I was researching this, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, and I was looking more in depth, especially looking at the recording of his vision, and that vision was recorded by the Bishop of Caesarea, who was writing a book at the time. His name is Eusebius, and he was writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, the History of the Church. And this book that he was writing, it's a volume of actually 11 books. It was written in the early 4th century. And essentially, he was doing something that had never been done before, which is he was trying to record the history of the church from Christ up until the 4th century of the church. And in this volume of 11 books, the first 5 to 6, maybe 7 books, he's kind of establishing the divinity of Christ. He's talking about the martyrs of the church, and he's holding up the martyrs as kind of these pious men and women who should be honored because they were sharing in the suffering of Christ. He holds great esteem for the martyrs in his writings, all the way up through about chapter 8. In chapter 8, he introduces an emperor named Constantinius, who was actually Constantine's father, and he talks about him in more noble and kinder terms. And then he introduces his son Constantine, who he basically states is a emperor ordained by God. Now, this sounds weird because up until that point, it was the Roman emperors who were persecuting the church. And suddenly we have an emperor coming on scene who's been ordained by God. Now, between books 8 and 9 in this volume called Ecclesiastical History, there's inserted a book called the Book of the Martyrs. And it goes into depth into what's known as the Great Persecution. The Great Persecution took place in Caesarea and Palestine, which is where Eusebius was from. And he actually goes into depth into the persecutions that took place during this period. It was one of the bloodiest, most violent persecutions in the history of the church. And actually, Eusebius records that he knew, because this was happening literally in his backyard, he knew many of the martyrs himself, and he saw some of their deaths with his own eyes. So the persecution touched him. Then going back into chapter 8 and into chapters 9, 10, and our books 9, 10, and 11, his focus changes from holding up the piety of the martyrs to focusing much more on the emperors and how they can begin to remove them or end this persecution. And this is where it gets really striking, because when you read the teachings of Jesus, right, and I actually did a live stream on this earlier today, on some of the understanding of the Old Testament. The Old Testament nation of Israel had what was called a land covenant with the God of Abraham. This land covenant stated that if they obeyed God, he would bless them and they would prosper in their lands. And if they disobeyed God, he would curse them and exile them from their lands. So for the people of Israel, one of their barometers in their relationship with God was their prosperity. If they were prosperous, they could assume they were doing well in their following and behavior with God. If they were not prospering, they might want to check what they were doing because they may be out of sorts with God, outside of his will, outside of his commands. And so it wasn't the only barometer, but one of their key barometers of their relationship with God was their prosperity. And when Jesus entered into the world, Israel was not prospering. They were under the oppression of the Roman Empire. They did not have control over their lands. They were being taxed. They were being censused. Censuses being taken. They were not able to worship freely. They were under the oppression of the Romans, and they were looking for God to send a Messiah to restore them back to the greatness of the kingdom of David. Well, when Jesus came onto the scene, he came as the Messiah. He came as the Son of God, but he was born in a barn. He was raised as a refugee in Egypt. He grew up in the backwater town of Nazareth. He did not come like a Messiah would be expected to come. He did not come with power, with prestige, with wealth, any of these things. He came really kind of in the exact opposite. And he said things like his kingdom wasn't of this earth. And he did not come to establish a Christian empire. And he told his disciples that not only was he going to be persecuted and even lose his life, but he said that they themselves, as his disciples, would also be persecuted. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he told them that they should count themselves blessed when they were persecuted. So he changed the barometer on them. They now were no longer looking to prosper. They knew they were doing well in their discipleship, not when they were prosperous and wealthy, but when they were being persecuted. Now, the disciples didn't like that barometer. They pushed back against it. Peter said, you don't have to die that way. You don't have to live that way. Jesus called him Satan and said, get behind me. You're not on the side of God, but of men. And throughout the rest of his ministry, Jesus was basically debating with his disciples, and they did not want to lose their life. And Jesus was adamant that he was walking to the cross, to his own crucifixion, carrying his own cross. And it wasn't until Pentecost that the disciples finally got the message. And after that, most of them went on to die a martyr's death. And that persecution continued all the way up until the 4th century and Eusebius. And then when the persecution touched him, he decided he wanted to go back to this notion of prosperity. And so he propped up Constantine as a God-ordained emperor.
Mm-hmm.
And he was now trying to save his own life, and prevent the church from being persecuted, which is contrary to what Jesus taught. Our Constantine bites, converts to Christianity, and Christianizes Rome, creates a Christian empire. And so this is where the church, right, begins to skew away from what Jesus taught. If Jesus said be persecuted, the church said, no, we're going to prosper instead. Right. Jesus said, my kingdom's somewhere else. Then the church said, no, our kingdom's here. It's an earthly empire. They begin to skew. And at first, the schism doesn't appear very big. But now here we are in 2021, and the distance between the two is absolutely massive. And so this is one of the biggest challenges that we have as a nation, is that this country, because it was founded as a Christian empire, because it believed that it had a manifest destiny, because it claimed Old Testament Israel's notion of a promised land, this is why the United States of America has been able to build on its history of both enslavement of African people as well as outright genocide of Native peoples, and still call itself Christian. Because if you read the Old Testament, even going back to Steve Newcomb's book, Pagans in the Promised Land, what do you do with pagans who are living in your promised land? Well, you kill them. This is what God said to Joshua in the book of Joshua and in Deuteronomy. So when you have promised lands, the belief is that you have God's permission to commit genocide, which is absolutely what this nation did, and why it does not feel it needs to be held accountable for its own history. So, yeah, those first 4 chapters, especially chapters 3 and 4, where we go very much in depth into how we got from the teachings of Jesus to this dehumanizing doctrine of discovery. It's a very important journey. And it's something I want not only Christians to understand, I want the nation to understand it. because the church and empire have been so intertwined for 2,000 years. You know, we tell ourselves that there's a separation of church and state here. There's really not.
Right.
And so if you want to understand the history of the United States of America, you have to understand the history of the church.
Right.
And that's what this book, Unsettling Truths, is trying to do. I'm trying to lay out, both myself and my co-author, Soong-Chan Rah, are trying to lay out, here's this history of how the church had the skew from what Jesus taught. And now we live in this world that does not make sense. Either it's not a healthy world even from a worldview standpoint, and it's completely unhealthy from a Christian standpoint.
Right. Yeah. One of the things too that I wanted to touch on just a little bit is in your timeline, you sort of talk about you go through like the first the third century, excuse me, and then you go through the 4th century. But then in the 5th century, there's this theory that Augustine sort of develops.
Yeah.
And in my mind, and maybe not in yours, but in my mind, I think for me at least, it made a lot of things click.
Yeah. So with Augustine, and he's fascinating, right? So Constantine is writing, and Eusebius is writing, and Constantine's creating Christendom in the 4th century. And then they have this Christian empire, which is completely opposed to what Jesus taught. And actually, if you read Eusebius's writing, if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, you would assume your book doesn't have a conclusion, because the history of the church will conclude when the bride of the church, Christ, returns. Well, if you read the final chapter of the final book of Ecclesiastical History, according to Eusebius, there is a conclusion. And the conclusion is the salvation that comes to Rome, not through Christ, but through Constantine. He literally writes Christ out of ecclesiastical history, which is what you have to do if you want to have a Christian empire. Because your biggest opposition to creating Christian empire is going to be Christ himself. And so he literally has to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history and insert Constantine. And then his second book, The Life of the Blessed Constantine, is just flat out heresy, where he just props Constantine up as a savior figure, a messiah figure. And so when Augustine is around in the next century, he now is the first real theologian, first major theologian, who has to figure out, what do we do with this heresy, this thing known as Christendom? Do we prophesy to it, or do we collude with it? Now, Augustine is very well known for writing what's known as the just war theory. The just war theory really served two purposes. One purpose was to help nations to fight wars more justly. Second, its purpose was to justify how Christian citizens of these Christian nations can go off and kill in the name of God and country, because a plain text reading of Jesus' teachings doesn't allow you to do that. So you have to do some theological gymnastics to get to the point where you can justify Christians killing in the name of Christ. And so I understood the fact that because he wrote a just war theory, he was choosing to collude with the heresy rather than to prophesy to it. But I wanted to see where he crossed the line, right? Because it's in crossing the line, like when you cross the line with Christ, he tends to call you out on it, right? When Peter said, "You don't have to die," Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." You're not on the side of God, but of men. So he'll call you out. And so I was looking through Constantine's writing on just war. I was looking through his writings on the two kingdoms. I couldn't find where he crossed the line. And then I was looking through his book on, it's called On the Correction of the Donatists. And the Donatists were a heretical group. They were kind of a thorn in Augustine's side most of his life. And in chapters 5 and 6, Augustine is wrestling with this notion of what is the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire. This is a phenomenon they've never had before. They've always had oppressed Christians in a secular empire. And now they have a Christian leader, a Christian king, who's leading this Christendom, this Christian empire. And Augustine is asking, what's the role? And he concludes that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to compel people through fear, punishment, and pain to keep the commands of God and to worship him, to keep the commands of the church and to worship God. That's the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire. St. Aquinas, who wrote hundreds of years later, he was also wrestling with heretics and heresy. And he said that if secular empires have the authority to kill men who break man's laws, how much more authority should the church have, he said, to kill people who break God's laws? And so he writes that once a person is convicted of heresy, not only should they be excommunicated, but they should be killed. So here we have both Augustine saying the church has the right to compel people through fear, punishment, and pain to worship God and keep the commands of the church. And then you have Thomas Aquinas writing that the church has the right to kill people who don't keep the commands of the church or worship God. This is completely opposite of what Jesus taught. And so this is where we have the theologians, instead of prophesying to this heresy known as Christian empire, they're colluding with it. And they're beginning to prop it up and to do these theological gymnastics to be able to justify this creation of what's known as Christendom.
Right. So, so embedded sort of in there is this idea of infidel, right? That the lesser person, the
yes, as they're wrestling through this. So after Augustine writes this, his writings lead directly into what are known as the Crusades, which is about both expanding Christendom as well as protecting Jerusalem. And then after Thomas Aquinas writes, then we have a few, this is like in the 1300s, I think, we have the church creating a new category known as the infidel. This is essentially, it's a subhuman category. It was first applied to the Moors or to the Muslims and later applied to indigenous people, anyone who didn't worship the God of the white European Christian male. And now that they have this category known as the infidel, now they didn't even need a just war theory to justify their wars, because now they could go to war based on this understanding that they were fighting a religious war. They were fighting the enemies of Christ. They were fighting the infidel. And that is literally what leads directly into the writing of the Doctrine of Discovery, which is about, now that we have this infidel, this subhuman, this savage, now what do we do with it? Well, we exploit them, we enslave them, we generate them for our own use and profit, is what the church was saying. This is when the writings of the papal bulls, Pope Gregory V, who writes the papal bulls, and one of the first papal bulls of creating the Doctrine of Discovery.
Somebody earlier was asking, papal bulls. Papal bulls essentially are just edicts that were given by the Pope, and they were sort of
kind of legal theological edicts of the church.
Yep.
That were put out by the church.
Right. So let's fast forward just a hair into the guy that was lost at sea, Mr. Columbus. So he brings this ideology of finding land, and it's this doctrine of discovery is obvious because he finds land that's already inhabited, and now this is sort of the foundation of how America is set up. You touched a little bit on how these ideas sort of started, or basically are embedded within the ideology of the creation of the, first of all, the Declaration of Independence, and then into the Constitution. And so, but before some of that, there was some pushback initially by the Protestants. Did you say?
Yeah. So Columbus, armed with this Doctrine of Discovery, discovers Turtle Island, right? based on this understanding that white people are superior and native people are savages. And so he discovers these lands even though they're already inhabited. And that discovery leads to incredible ethnic cleansing and injustice and oppression. But initially, the Doctrine of Discovery, it came out of the Catholic Church. These were Catholic doctrines that were coming out. And the Protestant church was doing its own thing. They were having their own Reformation. They were kind of doing their own thing. So they saw this as a Catholic doctrine, and they weren't fully buying into it. In 1630, John Winthrop, who was a Protestant, and he was on board a ship, and they were in the Boston Harbor. Well, now it's the Boston Harbor. Back then it was just a harbor. And they were there to plant the Boston colony. This is in 1630. And John Winthrop, on board that ship, he preaches a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In this sermon, he refers to the colonists that he's with as they're sitting on a hill, which is he's borrowing from the language of Jesus now, who uses that phrase in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's telling his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He then goes on to exhort them, just your basic Protestant exhortations, and all meekness, gentleness, patience, liberality, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. He's just preaching to them. End of his sermon, he's trying to convince them to heed his exhortations. And so he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is this passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over to take possession of their promised land. And Moses and Joshua are reiterating the threats and promises of the land covenant. If you obey God, he'll do these things for you. If you disobey him, he'll do these things to you. Now, in this passage in Deuteronomy 30, it's setting up the same scenario where if we will obey God and don't worship false gods, and he's going to protect us and he's going to bless us. If we disobey God, he's going to remove us from these lands. And it says that we cross over this river to take possession of. Deuteronomy 30 says, as we cross over this river, because they're standing at the banks of the Jordan River.
Right.
In his sermon, John Winthrop changes that word river. Some versions use the actual word the Jordan, and he changes that to vast sea. Now, why would he do that? Well, because they didn't cross the river. He didn't cross the river. He crossed an ocean. So by implication, he's saying that these colonists, these Protestants in the Boston Harbor, are on the shores of their promised land, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, this becomes problematic because if you read the book of Joshua, as I said earlier, the way that Israel was commanded to take possession of their promised lands was literally to ethnically cleanse them, to commit genocide. So that sermon that John Winthrop is preaching, he's again exhorting the people. He's telling them that they are about ready to take possession of their promised land, which implies a justification for ethnic cleansing and genocide. And that's the sermon. I refer to that sermon as the birth of American exceptionalism.
Wow.
The belief that America is somehow chosen by God, somehow set aside, a city on a hill, has a unique, special relationship with God, even based on the notion of manifest destiny, has the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. And so, so that idea, that notion of exceptionalism, this is in the 1630s, it percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins expanding westward. It's not even a nation yet. These colonies been expanding westward. They go past the Appalachian Mountains. They go past the Mississippi River. This is right when they're writing the Declaration of Independence, and they're accusing King George of turning these merciless Indian savages against them and preventing them from claiming their promised land or discovering the lands that are west of there. And then end of the 1700s, there's this Second Great Awakening, this spiritual revival. There's a growth in churches, a renewal in denominations. And now there's this spiritual fervor as the nation is moving further and further west. And then early 1800s, 1830s, 1840s, the term manifest destiny is coined. the belief that the nation has this God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea.
Right.
And this, if we look at that history, especially if we look at the history of the 1800s, the 19th century, which our history books refer to as our century of expansion, we add 30 new states to the Union during the 19th century. Well, if you look at that history, literally our nation is going through an ethnically cleansing, committing genocide against Native nations. In fact, one of the most worst aggressors, one of the most white supremacist, genocidal presidents in our nation's history was in office from 1860 to 1865, Abraham Lincoln.
Mm.
In 1862, he signed the Pacific Railway Act, as well as a Settlement Act. And literally within 2 years of signing those bills, he, after the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the forced removal of the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota, after the Sand Creek Massacre and the removal of the Cheyenne and Arapaho from Colorado, and after the Long Walk and the ethnic cleansing of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache from the territory of New Mexico, he has literally ethnically cleansed 3 or 4 states of natives, which were the 3 primary routes of the Transcontinental Railway, literally making him one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history, and therefore one of our greatest presidents is what history calls him.
Right.
Even though he was, and in these, there's 2 other chapters about this in our book. It's chapters 9 and 10, 2 of the most challenging chapters, I think, to read, because it really deconstructs this mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And the thing I tell people who are Americans have a very hard time seeing the vileness of Lincoln.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons we have a hard time seeing that is because history is written by the victors. And one of the challenges the United States faces is we've never lost a war that matters. We've never surrendered. We've never given up land. We've never had a regime change. We've never been disarmed. We've never lost a war that matters. So for 250 years, we've written our own history.
Right.
And imagine, right? Let's imagine that Nazi Germany wins World War II. How would their history books record the history of Adolf Hitler?
Mm.
He'd be their greatest leader ever.
Right.
How would they record the Holocaust? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they lost the war. What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. This is exactly what we did. So we took one of our most white supremacist, genocidal presidents and made him our hero because we, the white Europeans, white Americans, were able to write their own history. Right. Because they were winning the wars. And so, yeah, our nation is woefully undereducated on the atrocities committed by President Abraham Lincoln.
Right. Norman says, "Whoa, God bless the USA is another gospel." That's absolutely true, because I mean, in all of your conversations and all of your presentations, one thing sticks out the most to me when you're sort of along this narrative, and and it was never more evident to me as a young Native boy growing up, hearing our tribal history versus well, first of all, my tribal history isn't as rich as, say, the Lakota that are south of us, and I'm in the Dakotas as well. But our only claim to fame is that when Lewis and Clark were pushing west in their exploration, they got what commonly would be called, her name is Sacagawea, but her name is actually pronounced Sagagawea. And so we're not as well known as some of the more well-known tribes. And so our history isn't as documented as some, like, you know, the Cherokee, the Navajo, some bigger names, you know. And so knowing my history, knowing the holes that are within the narrative that was taught, it's clear to us that we aren't teaching an actual history.
No.
And you say time and time again that we're actually in this country teaching a mythology. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So again, because the United States of America has never lost a war that matters, and it's been able to write its own history for 250 years. It's been able to rewrite and skew the narrative on so many of our injustices that we don't even know what we've done as a nation. You know, I remember that one of the first times I read this history about Abraham Lincoln, and I came across a quote by him. There's actually a quote by Lincoln. It's hanging at the Lincoln Memorial. And in this quote, it says, "I would save the Union. My primary object in this struggle," wrote Abraham Lincoln, "is not to save or destroy slavery, it's to preserve the Union. If I could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." That's a quote by Lincoln hanging in the museum at the Lincoln Memorial.
Right.
When you stand there and read it, it literally is Abraham Lincoln saying Black lives don't matter.
Right.
If I could do this with it doesn't matter to me. I don't care about Black lives. I'm trying to preserve the Union, is what he said. And that's on display there, not as a memorial or as a thing of shame. It's showing how much Lincoln loved the Union, so much that he didn't give a crap about Black lives. And so this is where, as a nation, right, we really struggle with our own history. We don't teach a history, we teach a mythology.
Right.
You know, and we don't know what actually happened in our past. You know, one of the things and this is, I keep going back to Lincoln, but you know, we have both Democrats and Republicans say, you know, they aspire to be like Lincoln. Well, Abraham Lincoln, one of the things he's best known for is freeing the slaves.
Right.
The 13th Amendment, right? Well, if you actually read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't actually free the slaves. What it says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States.
Right.
The 13th Amendment doesn't end slavery. It redefines and codifies slavery under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. This is the criminal justice system that in the last 40 years has started a war on drugs, which is actually a war on race, has written crime bills that create mass incarceration of people of color. We have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and we incarcerate our people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate that we incarcerate white people.
Right.
We have people of color sitting in a Starbucks trying to drink coffee, and they get arrested. We have people of color being shot to death by police, sometimes with their backs turned and even unarmed. We hear about all of the ones that actually happen to African Americans, which is a travesty. But do you know what? If you look at the 5 top categories of people most likely to be shot by police, Native Americans occupy 3 of the top 5 spots.
Wow.
When you break it out by race and age group. Native Americans have an incredibly high chance of being shot by police. Our stories just don't make the news.
Right.
They just don't make the news. That's one of the big differences. And so, yeah, this is the challenge that we're facing is we don't know our own history. One of the things I'm working on, and I come to this conclusion in the book, and I use this theme throughout my campaign when I ran for president back in just a few months ago. It finished up in 2020. Is this notion that George Erasmus, who's a Dene elder from one of the tribes up in Canada, and he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he used this quote where he said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he wrote, you have to start by creating common memory. I love that quote. I think it's genius, because I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a mythological legacy of discovery, expansion, opportunity, and exceptionalism. We have peoples of color that have the lived history of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of internment camps and boarding schools and Indian massacres, of segregation and mass incarceration, of families being ripped apart at our borders. And there's no common memory. And if you look back over our nation's history, there's actually no point in US history where you can point to and say, we had healthy relationships across racial lines. We had healthy community. It doesn't exist within the United States history. And so this is one of the things I'm so adamant to work on. One of my primary visions, my primary goals, is I want a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation that I would put on par with the truth and reconciliation commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I wouldn't call ours truth and reconciliation, though, because reconciliation implies that there was a previous harmony,
Right.
which isn't accurate. I would use the term, and I do use the term, truth and conciliation. So if reconciliation is restoring harmony that used to exist, conciliation is about mediating a dispute. So reconciliation perpetuates the myth. Conciliation gives us an honest starting point and lets us move forward to build healthy community beyond that. They both get us to a better place. It's just one is more honest and the other perpetuates the myth that isn't true.
Right. And so we're about an hour or just short of an hour here. So do you have time for some questions, Mark?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so just before we get into that, I wanted to talk about you. You talked about you had several audiences that you wanted to get this lesson out to. You know, you wanted this stuff, but I was looking at you wanted the church to understand this, Native people, and communities of color.
Yeah.
But what I found most interesting was that you sort of identified a way for us to all come to the table at a even kill, if you will, where you talk about this idea of trauma being something that's across the board and not just the being, some of the ways that we've approached it. White people are racist, so that sort of closes the door, or white people are fragile, and that closes the door. So can you kind of explain to us a little bit of your thoughts and some of your thoughts about this idea of trauma and how it affects each class, whether it's the oppressor class or the oppression class?
Yeah, we actually have 2 chapters in our book here on trauma. It's a very important topic to understanding this. And we don't have time to go really in depth into it, but I can definitely touch on a few things. So when we talk about trauma, most people are aware of what's known as PTS or PTSD, post-traumatic stress,
right,
or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a diagnosis, an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a horrifying event. It affects you mentally, physically, emotionally. It's kind of this all-encompassing condition, but it's for an individual who has experienced a unique or a single traumatizing event. Now, there's another trauma known as a complex PTSD. So a complex PTSD, it's also an individual diagnosis, but it afflicts a person who's been traumatized numerous times. So if you can get PTSD from being assaulted, you can get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. If you get PTSD from being in a battle, you get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. Now, psychologists have researched and they found evidence that a complex PTSD can be passed down from one generation to the next. They don't know exactly how it happens, but they see that there's evidence of this trauma existing in the children and grandchildren, and generations of the people who were initially traumatized. Now, there's another trauma called HTR, which is historical trauma. Historical trauma is not an individual diagnosis. It's actually how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. The natives was the first community they identified it in after our history with boarding schools. But you can see symptoms of historical trauma also in African American communities after segregation and Jim Crow laws and mass incarceration and enslavement. You can see it in Japanese American communities after the internment camps. You can see it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. So if you have a complex PTSD on an individual level, you have historical trauma on a multi-generational and communal level. And so understanding this is helpful, because if I'm going to talk to a Native community or to an African American community or to another oppressed community, I can understand both the PTSD, the complex PTSD, as well as the historical trauma afflicting that community. And I can prepare myself going in, right? Because when you deal with trauma, you can trigger things and get reactions. And if you're not prepared for what you're going to see, it can derail your work. So understanding the condition of the community before you go into it is very helpful in preparation and in making sure your message doesn't get derailed. Now, there's another trauma out there that doesn't get near as much attention, and it's actually called PITS. The psychologist who did the research on this, her name is Rachel McNair. She wrote a book, PITS, which stands for Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. She identifies PITS as being like PTSD in almost every way, shape, and form, except if PTSD afflicts the victim of a horrifying event, PITS would afflict the perpetrator. She refers to it actually as the psychology of killing. So if you have a license to kill, if you have the state somehow gives you a license to kill in certain situations, whether you're a police officer, whether you're a soldier or whatever else, you have a license to kill somebody at some point. You're justified to do that. What does that do to you psychologically? She looked at a very comprehensive study on Vietnam vets. She looked at this quote by Socrates, who said the doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer. And she concluded that this creates a condition known as PITS, a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, that is almost identical to PTSD, except PTSD afflicts the victim of the horrifying event and PITS afflicts the perpetrator. So I would hypothesize that if PTSD has a multi-generational and communal manifestation at a complex level known as historical trauma,
right,
and that afflicts our communities of color, it would make sense that PITS would also have a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex nature that would afflict the white America. Now, I would not say white America is victims of trauma. Again, this is a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, but they do experience trauma. And so when I prepare to deal with audiences, when I prepare to present to audiences, if I'm going to talk to a white audience, I am preparing to talk to another group of traumatized people. Not victims of trauma, but perpetrators experiencing a perpetration-induced traumatic stress at a communal level. And I found that this has been one of the best tools I've ever developed to keep white people from derailing my work.
Right.
It's not about doing their work for them. If I understand that they're traumatized, it helps me to prepare my work so that they don't derail it. One of the ways you see this clearly is right now in most racial dialogues, white people are put into one of two categories. They're either racist or they're fragile. After the murder of the lynching of George Floyd, one of the best-selling books in the United States was called White Fragility. Now, Robin DiAngelo, the author of that book, has some great insight into the psyche of white America And she highlights that in that book. And I think she has some very good insight. I struggle with the paradigm of fragility, because that paradigm demands, or at least lends itself to, a certain kind of treatment.
Right.
If I'm helping you move and you have a box and it's marked fragile, and I walk up to that box, I have one of two choices. I can trust it, pick it up carefully and put it gently in the truck, or I can disregard it. Oh, I saw Phil pack this box. There's just towels in it. And I can dismiss the sign and throw it into the back of the truck, not realizing you put your china at the bottom of the box underneath your towels, which I've now broken because I've ignored your sign.
Right.
And so when you deal with fragility, you label something as fragile, it almost demands a certain kind of treatment.
Yeah.
The other category we put white people in is the category of racist. White people are racist, is what some will say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't find that to be helpful. If people are racist simply because they lack pigmentation in their skin, it means anytime a white person disagrees with me, I have to either defend myself or even go offensively against them. I have to protect myself, defend myself, and strike back. If white people are racist simply because they're white, it means there's no space for them in the conversation.
Right.
That's not helpful. What I like about understanding white people as traumatized is it gives me more options of how to interact with them. One of the first symptoms of trauma is shock and denial. And usually, because shock and denial is one of the first symptoms of trauma, it's your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors who see that you're traumatized even before you do. And so they may try to counsel you or convince you to go see a counselor. Now, if you go to a counselor and you're still in the state of shock and denial, your counselor is going to have wide open kind of just exploratory conversations with you,
Right.
trying to get you to talk about things. What they're doing is they're looking for your triggers. There's a disconnect between your psyche and your reality, and your counselor is exploring your world to try and find out what those triggers are. So let's say you're sitting in your counselor's office and your trigger for whatever reason is butterflies. And so as you're talking, a swarm of butterflies flies by the window. Your heart starts beating harder. Your adrenaline starts pumping. You get a bitter taste in your mouth, and you become on edge or uneasy, and you begin to respond out more emotionally. Now, if your counselor is worth their salt, they'll see what's going on for you, and they'll give you some space.
Right.
What they won't do is they won't slam the window shut and promise to exterminate the butterflies tomorrow. Right? They'll let you have your little episode. They'll let you react. They'll keep you safe and keep themselves safe. And then after that's over, whether that session or a future session, they will come back to you and say, so let's talk about butterflies. Right? This is what makes counselors so annoying, is they find your triggers and they want to talk about them. And so because we treat white people as either racist or fragile, and if they're fragile, we soothe things over, and if they're racist, we confront them, we never actually get to have the more in-depth conversation.
Right.
By understanding white people are traumatized, not victims of trauma, but experiencing a multi-generational and communal manifestation of a complex perpetration-induced traumatic stress, I can now, again, when I trigger them through my presentations, let them have their episode, keep them safe and keep me safe. And then after that episode's over, their adrenaline stopped flowing, they're calmed down. Hey, we should talk about that.
Right.
Why did that upset you so much? What's going on for you? Let's have a conversation. Now that we know what your trigger is, we know what is disconnected between your psyche and your reality. Now we can explore that to get to the heart of the matter. This is actually one of the best tools I've developed to actually have these sorts of dialogues without letting white people derail them.
Right.
And so, yeah, this is something and this is my goal. I'm not trying to convince white people they're traumatized. I just treat them that way.
Right.
My goal is I want people of color to understand that white America is another group of traumatized people. so that we can prepare ourselves better, so that we can prevent them from derailing our work when we trigger them, which we will trigger them.
Right.
It's not doing their work for them. It's making sure they don't disrupt the work that we're trying to do.
Awesome. Yeah, that to me, when I heard that and when I read through that, and I mean, because Mr. Charles, I literally spent about 3 weeks watching, rewatching, reading the book. I listened to the audio book probably 3 times, and every time I was blown away, because this is, first of all, it's the most comprehensive way to approach this, because far more times when you see this conversation happening, and I've said it before, and I've said it especially after George Floyd, that everyone sort of goes to their theological or ideological bunkers. They hunker down and then they throw truth bombs over the issue rather than taking down the wall itself. And we there's a many of us within the urban apologetics community who have been trying to brainstorm and think of, how do we approach this issue, because our heart's cry is to get to the mainstream church, because unfortunately one of the reasons why we have urban apologetics is because the mainstream apologetics just doesn't, it's not as nuanced, and it doesn't directly attack some of the things that we see on a regular basis. And so really kudos and hats off to you for this approach. And it was a breath of fresh air, when I read this, because really, I mean, my heart, and my heart of hearts is really, and God put this on me early in my ministry as a teen, is that I seen the fracture even within the church.
Yeah.
And moreover, I seen the fracture within the race within the church. And so all of those things touched me early on in my ministry. And so I guess my first question, and we'll just take a couple because I only seen one in the chat and then I only had a couple, but I don't want to tie you up for too long. So my first question is what do we do with this? Now we have this information. Now we, of course we have to process, but how do we because a majority of my audience is minority, or we considered minority, or they're minority sensitive. So they would know how to approach these types of things. So what do we do to open a dialogue with those that aren't so open, Mr. Charles?
Yeah. So one of the things that we need to do, it's very important that we know who we're talking with, right? So if I'm talking with a community of color, if I'm talking with natives or African Americans, or I'm talking with white people, I want to understand what is the baggage that they're bringing into the dialogue or the situation, so that I can best be able to address it and hopefully communicate some things more clearly. The other thing we have to do, and this actually took a long time on my part as well, is we have to know who we are. And how do we come into these conversations?
Right.
And, one of the things that I think is so important is, as a Native man, I understand that I bring a unique voice, and Native peoples, we bring a unique voice that our nation has never really learned how to hear and even wrestle with the voice from Native America, right? And throughout all of our history, we've either been the savage who's threatening their land and their families, or we're this noble, this noble savage who has these great pearls of wisdom.
Yeah.
But they don't know how to deal with us as people and as humans. Either we're charity, or we're, and so who are we in this conversation? I remember I was experiencing this very early on. This is probably almost 2 decades ago. When I first moved back, I was the pastor of a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And we moved back to the Navajo Nation, so I could engage in dialogue around race and worship and things like that better.
Right.
And when we moved there, we actually moved to a very remote section of our reservation. and we were living in a traditional hogan, which is where wireless hogan came in, because we literally were in a wireless hogan. The community we lived in had no running water, no electricity. There was no,
Wow.
we were off the grid completely. 6 miles off the nearest paved road on it. We literally were living in a wireless hogan.
Nice.
But and to move there, you know, we had to prepare to live off the grid. We had prepared to live by candlelight. We were prepared to use an outhouse and to herd sheep and to haul water and all the things that we had to adjust to living off the grid like that.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that caught us by surprise is very shortly after we moved there, we realized how completely marginalized the reservation community is. And I realized that the only non-natives we almost ever saw were those who came to take our picture or those who came to give us charity.
Right.
Nobody came to just sit down, have a cup of coffee, and get to know us.
Right.
And I'm experiencing that. I felt like I fell off the face of the earth, right? I just dropped off a corner of the earth, and just suddenly I'm like, I don't even know where we were anymore. But then I'm also learning the history. I'm learning about the Doctrine of Discovery. I'm seeing this incredible oppression, and I'm seeing how deeply marginalized Native communities are to this day. And as I'm in that situation, I can feel myself becoming more and more angry. I can feel myself becoming really wrestling with some A, insecurities, and B, some very real anger. And every time the conversation would come up between myself and my non-native friends, I could sense this emotion coming up in me. And if I didn't bottle it well, I had to hang up the phone so I wouldn't yell at my friends, which I was tempted to do. And so I learned how to kind of disconnect. I learned how to talk about these issues like I read in the newspaper. I could stay in the conversation that way longer. But then the longer I was in the conversation, the more I saw my defense of my friends go up. I didn't do that to your family. They said it wasn't my people who did that to your people.
Right.
This isn't my fault. And soon they would hang up the phone. And I didn't know how to have a conversation about these issues that A, was honest and honored how I felt, but B, drew people into the conversation instead of repelling them from it. And one day I was writing a letter to my friends, my non-native friends. It's like the 10th time trying to get them to understand how it felt. And in my letter, I said to them, I said, being Native American and living on an Indian reservation, it feels like our Native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture. They're eating our food. They're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to the bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're sick, we're weak, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, the thing that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I wrote that, I'm like, that's it. That's exactly how I'm feeling. I started sharing that. People on the reservation, friends off the reservation, people living around me, some came up to me and said, you know, I've lived here all my life. It's been a struggle to know how to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. My non-native friends would come up and say, what does it mean to say thank you? How does my family, my church, my community, my city, my state, my country express gratitude to the indigenous peoples of this land? Well, now we're having a very different conversation. Now, instead of talking about victim and oppressor, we're talking about what I think is the heart of the matter, which is this reversal of roles, which is we have white America, this white majority that has never asked for, nor have they ever been given permission to be here, and they're running around acting like they own the place. We have Native communities the indigenous hosts of Turtle Island, who have been pushed aside to reservations and marginalized communities speckled throughout this continent. And we're being treated as unwanted guests in someone else's house.
Right.
The goal is we have to reverse these roles. I want non-natives to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone's house. And I want our native people to understand in some very real and practical ways we are the host people of the land.
Amen.
And we need to conduct ourselves as the host. And so a big part of dealing with this well is understanding and knowing how are you entering into this conversation. Are you entering in as a guest? Are you entering in as a host? The third party that is has to be identified in this is the role of the African American. Because they're neither, right? They didn't immigrate here. They didn't choose to come here. They were kidnapped. Their ancestors were kidnapped and brought here and then enslaved. So they're neither immigrant nor are they indigenous to these lands. And so we have to acknowledge that they have another space here that is very unique. You know, our country loves to call itself a nation of immigrants, which is not accurate. When our country says we're a nation of immigrants, it ignores Native peoples who were indigenous to these lands, and it ignores African people who were kidnapped, brought here, and enslaved to these lands. And so I really try to encourage people to know, who are you and how are you entering into this conversation? And then what does it mean to stay in your lane? Right? What is your role in the conversation based on your role in these lands? And what does it mean to occupy your lane in this conversation? And so this is where I think I encourage our Native peoples, especially. We are entering this conversation as the host people of the land. Other communities of color are entering this conversation, whether they're immigrants or whether they're the ancestors of the descendants of enslaved peoples. They're entering into this conversation in a certain role with a certain history. And what does it mean to own that so that you can have the best representation within the conversation, knowing what space you're occupying in that dialogue? So that's something I think I really encourage people to look at closely at. Who are you? How are you entering this conversation? And what does it mean to be in the lane that you're occupying?
Right. Amazing stuff. I think we're going to wrap it up there. There was only one question in the live chat, but Adrian Jones, I apologize for the sake of time.
If you want to ask a question real quick, if it's a good question, I don't mind taking a minute to answer it.
Okay.
I'll leave it up to you.
All right. Well, I think it's something that you've answered before, and it could be pretty short, but it's Mr. Charles, what are your thoughts on the proposed patriotic education that the current administration is trying to push?
Yeah,
I've heard you talk about this a couple times. So.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, and this is the challenge we face as a nation. You know, one of the things I talked earlier about, this myth of American exceptionalism, and American exceptionalism is absolutely a myth. It's not true. We are not exceptional, right? We as far as education, we're in the middle of the pack. Healthcare, yes, we have some great hospitals. Our delivery of that healthcare is woefully inadequate.
Right.
Our infrastructure is crumbling. We're the only nation in the world that's used nuclear weapons on civilians, right? I mean, we are bankrupt, both morally as well as, like we are not exceptional by any stretch of the imagination. And yet we cling to this myth. Why do we cling to the myth? American exceptionalism is one of the most unifying themes in U.S. politics. Why? Well, the reason it's so unifying, the reason it's so strong, the reason especially white America clings to this narrative is because if America is not exceptional, if America does not have a unique role in the world and a special relationship with God and promised lands and chosenness and the permission to commit genocide, then we are merely another colonial, oppressive, genocidal nation. And that thought is unfathomable to most white people. And so they cling to this myth of exceptionalism as if their lives depended on it, because in many ways it feels like they do. Because they don't know how to cope with the reality of what our nation's actually done and what it's standing on. You know, you will hear people say, both inside the church and without, is because of our wealth. Right? People say, Bernie Sanders loves to say, we are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. We have some very wealthy people.
Right.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
We also have one of the greatest disparities of wealth.
Right.
Of every nation. I think there's only one other nation that has a greater disparity of wealth than we do. And so, yeah, we have some of the most wealthy people in the history of the world. But anyway, our country clings to this narrative of exceptionalism because it doesn't want to deal with the reality that if we're not exceptional, then we're actually accountable for our genocide, ethnic cleansing, enslavement, and oppressive history. And people don't know what to do with that. And so this is where it helps to understand white America as another group of traumatized people, and they are still in the state of shock and denial, right? So once we understand that, it's easy to see our nation's symptoms, white America's symptoms, right? We have states like Texas and Oklahoma. These are the states that produce a lot of our textbooks. And they have laws that says you can only teach patriotic history. They're trying to take the word slavery out of our history books. Why? Well, they're in a state of shock and denial. They don't know what to do with who they are and what they're standing on. And so they're in a state of denial. And so this whole thing about this teaching American exceptionalism, this is all about maintaining our nation's state of denial. We saw this even after these horrific attacks just this past week here in Washington, D.C., where I live, right? Where we literally, terrorists, attacked our Capitol, disrupted the work of Congress, and 5 people died. There was a terrorist attack on our nation's Capitol this last week.
Right.
Now, our 2 leaders, President Trump and President Biden, responded in 2 very different ways. President Trump responded with denial. First, he said nothing for hours. And then he's still in a state of denial that he has any responsibility of inciting this and of egging it on. And he's in a state of denial about it. Joe Biden, a few hours into the attack, went on camera and he said to our country, this is not who we are. That's not true. He said, this is not who we are. Americans can do anything if they put their mind to it. He was arguing, he was saying, what you're seeing on your televisions right now does not represent us, and we are still exceptional, is what he was saying. We are still exceptional. Well, that's not accurate either. The problem is, and I went on a live stream just an hour later, and I basically said, the challenge is this is who we are.
Right.
This is what we've been doing since 1492. This is who we are. Now we have a choice to make. We can acknowledge it and deal with it and make a choice to become something else, or we can just bury our head in the sand and not change anything. Neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden are going to lead to the systemic changes we need to make to change our situation.
Right.
Because neither one of them are able to acknowledge that this is who we are and this is what our problems are. Just like if anyone who's dealt with addiction, right? Your first step in dealing with addiction is acknowledging you have a problem.
Right.
If you can't acknowledge you have a problem, you are not going to get better. That's just a fact. And so what we need is we need our nation, and we need leaders who are able to acknowledge we have this problem, and we now have an option to make a choice to become something different. You know, the theme of my campaign when I ran my last campaign was I want to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people truly means all the people.
Right.
We can't do that until we acknowledge that's not what it means right now. And this is our problem, right? In his last State of the Union, President Obama, he was talking about the divisiveness of our nation. And he said, we the people. Our Constitution begins with these three simple words we've come to recognize mean all the people. I'm like, I don't recall us ever agreeing to that. That's a great idea, but we've never agreed to that. Joe Biden likes to quote the Declaration of Independence, and he quotes it, and he says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. That sounds great, Joe. That's not what it says.
Right.
It says we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal.
Right.
If we can't acknowledge what the problem is, we're not going to be able to fix it. And so this is where we have to create this common memory. We have to teach our actual history. We have to deal with who we are and how we got to where we are so we can make an intentional choice to do something different and become something else.
Man, that's all good stuff, brother. Mark, I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the fact that you were willing to answer some questions. And a lot of folks are asking out there how to get your book. So we've shared in the chat. I have some moderators who have been sharing your information. And but before we go, actually, we have some stuff to give away. We're not going to give away now, so I'm not going to tie you up, Mr. Charles. But we have one signed copy by you that I purchased about a month ago.
Okay.
And then I have 5 copies of the ebook that we're going to be giving away, and 5 Drops of Hope T-shirts that is sponsored by my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, and this is their company, Native Printing LLC. They're based out of North Dakota, so there's the email. And so here's how you can get registered. So those of you who are interested in a free copy of either the ebook or a t-shirt or a signed copy. So we'll be giving away the t-shirts first, and then we'll be giving away the ebooks and then the signed copy. But you have to like this video. You have to share it. You have to subscribe to both myself and Mr. Charles, and you have to leave a comment. And we'll be at 8 o'clock this evening. We'll be going live again after we've gathered all the comments and whoever has entered. And then we will be giving away all of those that merchandise. So all sponsored by Drops of Hope Ministries and by my mother and father in love, what is what we call each other, Native Printing LLC out of North Dakota. And special shout out to Bible Hacking and Carl Anthony. Thank you guys both for the super chats. Thank you guys so much for supporting this ministry. And that will go into as well more giveaways and more spreading of the gospel and giving away awesome, amazing books like Unsettling Truths. I mean, we've given away books before. We've hosted fundraisers and stuff like that to help give books away. And I mean, I believe in you. I believe in your content, and I have been pushing very hard to make sure that your name is getting out there, because this message, like Native people, has been forgotten.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, this whole concept, this, and like you said, you're not the first guy, but you're the guy right now who is pushing this narrative. And yeah, so some of the resources I've already picked up that you've mentioned throughout your TED Talk and throughout all of your presentations and stuff. So
yeah, well, thank you.
But before we go, Mr. Charles, do you have anything that's coming up? Anything that you'd want to announce to the folks, where they could catch you, where they could find you, more content, that type of stuff?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on social media. I have two major profiles on Facebook. My personal page, just the normal where I have friends and everything. I don't use that page as much, which is Wireless Hogan. I have another, my professional page, which is Mark Charles Wireless Hogan. Those are all linked from my website. My website is wirelesshogan.com, and that's also where you can buy signed copies of my book too. That's linked on all my social media, as well as on my Wireless Hogan website. You can click there to purchase a signed copy of my book. And I have a YouTube channel, an Instagram channel, and I'm trying to get more active on TikTok. So, and about 2 or 3 times a week. We started this during my campaign, and it was so successful, we decided to continue it, which is both on my Facebook channels and on my YouTube channel. About 2 or 3 times a week, we'll have what I call my second cup of coffee, where sometime around 11 a.m. Eastern time, I'll sit down when I'm drinking my second cup of coffee, and I'll talk about the events of the day. Usually it's around political themes. This morning, I kind of preached a sermon where I talked about a passage in Second Chronicles that often gets misinterpreted during crises like the one we're facing right now. And so I talked about that. So that's a great place where people can kind of get some of the stuff that I'm thinking about most recently, is when I do my second cup of coffees. They're not scheduled. I usually just go live and I'll stream it to my Facebook and YouTube channels. And then after we stream it, we'll post it to my Instagram television channel, IGTV. And that's Wireless Hogan. So that's a great way to just stay tuned with what I'm doing. Also on Twitter, I'm Wireless Hogan. So yeah, those are some great places that people can connect with me. At the moment, the main thing I'm pushing right now is I'm just trying to get my book out there.
Right.
It came out in November of 2019, so it's been out for a little over a year now. Because my campaign just ended, I've been now focusing a lot on trying to get the publicity out about this book, because I think it fits so well the challenges we're facing both in the church and as a nation today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a lot of really good conversations that can be had out of this book, even with the stuff we've been dealing with in the past week. So yeah, I'm doing a lot to try and push that as much as I can and get that out there. I've been very pleased with how well it's been selling. I've been very pleased at how many conversations it's generating around the country. And if people want to do other podcasts with me, or they want to start book clubs or have readings or do Q&As, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to try and facilitate those as much as I can. But yeah, that's what I'm working on most directly right now. And it's been great to be on your show. So thanks for having me today. And I definitely look forward to having some conversation more in the future with you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, your folks have my information. I gave them my my phone number and everything, so they have all the ways to get a hold of me. So I mean, even if there's anything you just wanted to chat about on this platform, I give you an open invitation anytime. I would be definitely willing to have you on if there's new ideas or anything yeah. At all. I would love to have you. But I definitely consider it an absolute privilege to have you on today. I'm deeply humbled and praise God for your ministry, for your work, and for all the things that you do. And thank you so much for this gift of Unsettling Truths with you and Mr. Soong-Chan Rah, and all the work that you guys put into this. I mean, it's an absolute gem. I love it, and I think you guys will love it as well. So don't forget to comment. Don't forget to share. Don't forget to go to Mark Charles, Facebook, all his social medias, Wireless Hogan, and go and subscribe to his channel. Second Cup of Coffee, always very insightful, great stuff. I don't catch every single one, but I try to make it a point to get there and try to bug Mr. Charles, distract him a little bit if I can. But yeah, so Any last words, Mr. Charles?
That's all I think. So I just want to say ahiahat, thank you, and hakonet, which is not goodbye, but I'll talk to you again later. So walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together.
Mazgirad. Thank you.